By the early Carboniferous period, the first amniote animals, the first reptiles, had evolved. And they were anapsid reptiles. They lacked a temporal opening in this region, which would allow jaw muscles to become longer and allow for a more powerful bite. By the late Carboniferous, not only were there synapsid reptiles, which would include the ancestors of mammals, but then also diapsid reptiles, which had two of these openings. The diapsid reptiles would have a great future, and the Mesozoic era, sometimes referred to as the age of reptiles, would be dominated by diapsids, so many that it makes sense to split the diapsid reptiles, those that have two temporal openings like this crocodile, into two groups. The smaller of the two groups is known as the lepidosaurs, and includes lizards and snakes. Also included in the diapsids would be the reptiles which adapted to aquatic life, which I'll be reviewing at the end. And so this video hopes to go through, in addition to those aquatic reptiles, the lepidosaurs, which then include lizards, snakes, and the tuatara. So they are all diapsids, including three lineages alive today. The tuatara, the lizards and snakes, and we could also then include worm lizards, which, like lizards and snakes, are also in the group, the order Squamata. So here is this tuatara, which is still alive today, as I will mention presently. And in it, so here is a worm lizard, a lepidosaur diapsid. But in addition to these lepidosaurs, there was another group of diapsids, the archosaurs, the ruling reptiles. This will be the topic of the next video. And so the Carboniferous period at its beginning not only witnessed the very first anapsid reptiles, the first reptiles, but by the Carboniferous there were diverse groups of reptiles. They would diversify in the Permian period, but as we know, the end of the Paleozoic, the end of this Permian period, was the worst mass extinction in the history of planet Earth. And so the groups of diapsids in the end of the Paleozoic, many became extinct, only to be followed by those groups in the Mesozoic era. This would not only be the era that gives rise to archosaur lineages like crocodiles, pterosaurs, dinosaurs, and birds, but also of lepidosaur lineages, such as the first snakes. Lizards, we could argue, some feel that the first lizards are from the Permian, others feel that these were simply lizard relatives and that the first true lizards would be from the Mesozoic. And so the diapsids, they originate, their ancestors, in the Carboniferous and Permian, but they diversify greatly in the Mesozoic era. So diapsids begin humbly, even though their descendants would include, enormous dinosaurs, crocodiles, specialized birds, and the like. And so by the late Carboniferous period, there were very primitive forms. Notice how small they all are. So many of them are under a foot or a foot and a half long, many would have had a lizard-like body, although no lizards from the groups alive today would have been included in this lineage. And so from small, simple anapsid reptiles evolved these small, simple diapsid reptiles. And one could point to some of the Paleozoic reptiles and call them proto-diapsids, having some of the features of diapsids and not all of them. And so we could argue over the classification of many primitive reptiles because they are not in any modern groups, nor are they any in the more advanced groups which would come later. And so experts could, say this one, is a diapsid, but, then here we have animals which have some diapsid features, but not enough to put them in diapsids. And so in the family tree of life, there are transitions. There are organisms which have some, but not all of the features of later groups. And so the diapsids would be included in this. So once again, by the late Carboniferous period, there were diapsids, and a number of diapsid lineages would then diversify in the Permian, many of them small. Some of them would have arguably been bipedal, as were some of the later diapsids, like early crocodiles, certainly dinosaurs and pterosaur relatives. And even some lizards today are capable of running bipedally for short distances. One of the interesting groups of diapsids which evolved were a number of extinct forms which would have had the capability of gliding from these delicate and narrow bone structures. A wing membrane would have been or a skin membrane would have extended, which would have allowed some degree of gliding, certainly. Some of these are known from the Permian, the most primitive of these. A number were known from the Triassic, and then some would even then live into the Cretaceous period. So while later diapsids would include the flying pterosaurs, the flying birds, earlier forms were capable of gliding, which no doubt not only helped avoid predators, but also the insects had a diverse set of flying forms, and there were as yet no vertebrates capable of flying, or of preying on flying insects in the Permian period or early Triassic. So the ability to glide certainly would have been an advantage. So of the diapsids, there are two groups alive today: the ruling reptiles, the archosaurs, but then also a group known as the lepidosaurs. And there are these individuals from the late Permian which show some of the features of those lepidosaurs, which include lizards and snakes alive today. And so many of the groups of reptiles evolved slowly through transitional forms. And before there were true lepidosaurs, there were lepidosauriforms, which had some but not all of the features of the lepidosaurs. The lepidosaur lineages diversified. One prominent group in the Triassic period developed a horny beak, and arguably were specializing in eating plants. Some of them would later actually even be marine, adapting for aquatic life. So these rhinocephalians would include diverse forms which were rather successful. They would all become extinct with one exception. There is one lizard-like animal living in Indonesia, which is not a lizard. It is the tuatara. It is the only surviving member of this rhinocephalian group. And so there was one group of diapsids which had a number of fossil members, but only one surviving member. But once again, it is a lepidosaur diapsid. The lepidosaurs then also include the lizards and snakes. And lizards, once again, either originate in the Permian at the very end of the Paleozoic, or some classifications prefer to include the Permian forms as the sister group of true lizards, and thus lizards would then arise later. If lizards arose in the Permian, that would make them more primitive and an earlier group than turtles, crocodiles, snakes, and dinosaurs, all of which arose in the Mesozoic era. Fossil lizards were quite diverse in their form, as you can see here, just as modern lizards are quite diverse. So, some fossil lizards had longer necks than usual, modifications for burrowing that made them unique. And perhaps most interesting are those lizards which then adapted for life in the ocean, forming this group of marine lizards, the mosasaurs. These would be the largest lizards in history, but at 40 and even 50 feet in length, they would be among the largest reptiles in history. Notice that before there were the giant 40 and 50 foot forms, that there were some smaller forms, maybe only 3 feet long. And so lizards adapted to a diversity of lifestyles, including life in the ocean, as observed in the giant mosasaurs. And as indicated here, some of these marine lizards were truly enormous. Lizards are difficult to speak of as a biological group. In biology, we like terms where the group includes all members who have descended from a common ancestor. So all mammals, for example, include all of the descendants of the very first mammals which are alive today and their fossil relatives. The problem with using the word lizard, however, is that some lizards have lost their legs. Now, even today, there are legless lizards. One of the ways that one can tell is if one sees an eyelid on a legless reptile. Snakes have a transparent structure here, so they lack an eyelid, and so one can see, oh, it looks like a snake, but because it has an eyelid, it's a legless lizard. Reduced legs and leglessness has evolved several times. Now, if one were to consider the great diversity of lizards alive today, here's a group which includes certain families, here's a group which includes certain families. In this group, there are members known as worm lizards which lack legs. So just like some members of these groups might be legless lizards, here is a group of lizard descendants which lack legs, but we do not call them lizards. We call them worm lizards. They are their own separate group, even though they are just as much descended from the first lizards as are these other groups. They are considered their own suborder. Snakes are considered a suborder of the order Squamata, but the first snakes were also descended from lizards which had legs, and so therefore the term lizard is not a true biological group, because lizards include some of the descendants of the first lizards, but not the suborder of worm lizards, nor the suborder of snakes, even though these are just as much descended from the first lizards as are any lizards recognized today. So therefore, lizards are what we call a paraphyletic group. The word lizard includes some of the descendants of the first lizards, but not all, because some of the descendants of the first lizards are called worm lizards. These are legless forms today. So here you can see some photos of worm lizards. They are descended from lizards and they are members of the order Squamata, but they lack legs and are classified as their own suborder, just as snakes are classified in their own suborder. Before getting to snakes, once again, lizards are amazingly diverse today, and some lizards are more closely related to snakes than they are to other lizards. Some lizards are more closely related to those worm lizards than they are to other lizards. And so lizards, if they go back to the Permian, are the oldest surviving group of reptiles, and as such have had an enormous amount of time to diversify into separate lineages. Some are herbivores, eating plants. Most are carnivores. Some are actually capable of running on their hind legs briefly, like basilisks or frilled lizards. Two forms are actually poisonous: the Gila monster and the Mexican beaded lizard. They are capable of injecting venom in their bites. And so lizards are far more diverse than we often appreciate. So here I just have a few images showing that the first diapsids were no diapsids alive today. They were very primitive. We would recognize them by the two temporal openings, and all of the bones of their skull were essentially the same as what we had seen in the anapsid reptiles. They just added these temporal openings. These would include some gliding reptiles, some long-necked reptiles, and a great diversity of forms, including champsosaurs, which were not only aquatic reptiles, but would survive into not only the Mesozoic era, but then also the Cenozoic era. They actually survived the extinction at the end of the Mesozoic, but would not survive until the modern day. Some of the relatives of the Tuatara were aquatic, as indicated there. Here is the skeleton of a basilisk. Note that it is capable of running on its hind legs, briefly if it's trying to escape a predator. Lizard diversity includes some poisonous reptiles, such as the Gila monster of the American Southwest and Mexico. And then also, in addition to the giant Komodo dragon alive today, a 30-foot relative, which was once a dominant predator. So not only did lizards include dominant marine predators like these mosasaurs, but also dominant terrestrial predators. Before there were the giant mosasaurs, there were smaller marine lizards from which they evolved. And here you can see a lizard which has greatly lengthened its body with increasing the number of vertebrae. And notice that the limbs are smaller. Now, lizards have lost their legs a number of times. So here is a legless lizard. Once again, notice that if it has a visible eyelid, then that means it's a lizard rather than a snake. And this lizard is almost legless. If you look closely, you can still see little stumps of vestigial legs, which aren't really useful in locomotion, but which nevertheless indicate that this animal once had legged ancestors. Now that's interesting because not only are there worm lizards, which are mostly legless, although one group still has arms but not legs that they use in burrowing. And not only are there lizards here, which have some remnants of their legs, but also the first snakes, as I'll show you in the video, also have legs. And so there are a number which had hind limbs, including a femur, tibia and fibula, tarsal bones, and then even some foot bones, some metatarsals. But then even modern snakes include vestiges of limbs in their most primitive members. So things like boas, anacondas, and some blind snakes can have these little bony spurs where the hind limbs used to be. These are just remnants of the legs that were present in ancestral snakes. Now, these are the hemipenes, the pair of penises which define the order Squamata. So lizards and snakes both have this odd reproductive setup, even though only one of these structures would be used at a time, showing that lizards and snakes are biologically connected. But here, once again, there are these remnants of of the hind limbs. Now, snakes are quite diverse, as you'll see in the videos, and include a number of primitive snakes that many people don't know much about, like these primitive blind snakes and thread snakes. So snakes are descended from lizards which once had legs, and there is actually a fossil of a four-footed snake known. Tetrapodophis had a humerus, a radius, an ulna, metacarpals, phalanges, and for its leg, it had a hip, at least an ilium, a femur, tibia, fibula, metatarsals, and phalanges. So Tetrapodophis is the only snake which had both arms and legs in the fossil record. There are a number of snakes which lacked arms, but which did have legs, such as Pachyrhachis, Hasiophis, and Podophis. And once again, the legs that you and I have, or that a basal reptile has, include a femur, a tibia, a fibula, tarsal bones around the ankle, metatarsals, and phalanges. And when we look at these fossil snakes, then we see the same bones. And so the first snakes had legs, showing their link to legged lizards. Now, there are a number of fossil snakes known which have primitive limbs, and there has been some discussion over where these fossil snakes fit into the classification of snakes. So some of these were aquatic, and it was thought that maybe the first snakes evolved from mosasaurs, especially given that some lengthened their body and reduced the length of their limbs. But then Tetrapodophis and some other ones were terrestrial. And so there is discussion as to where it was that the first snakes evolved. Were they marine, and thus leglessness was an adaptation for that lifestyle? Were they terrestrial? And then there is some discussion on some of these fossil snakes, which, some of which have legs, some of this still have a pelvis and a sacrum. Where do they fit in the classification of snakes? Are they basal snakes, or are they in more of the specialized groups? And so this video just goes through some of the fossil snakes and some of their classification and some of the disagreements about involved in which of the fossil groups they belong to. I then also include a couple of videos on snake diversity, because once snakes evolved, they formed a family tree, which then began to diversify into a number of groups, many of which don't occur in the United States, and some include some very primitive members, which still have, say, those spurs where the legs once were, etc., including blind snakes, thread snakes. And as I go through these various lineages, I include some examples where there are some whose range is so narrow that they are then considered to be in danger of extinction. So once snakes evolved in the late Cretaceous, that certainly didn't mean that modern groups of snakes were present. Snakes form a family tree, and these evolved over stages. One notable anaconda relative could get to be 50 feet long, living in the Amazon, where not only today are there giant rodents the size of pigs, but also in the Cenozoic, there were larger fossil relatives which could get to be the size of small cattle. And so there are certainly diverse snakes alive today, and venom has evolved multiple times, and I go through some of the venomous groups such as the ELAPIDAE family, which includes cobras and coral snakes, and then later the viper family, which includes rattlesnakes and the like. Snakes apparently greatly increased their diversity around the time that mammals were becoming more common. So legless snakes can easily go into the burrows of mammals like mice. And the pit vipers then have adapted to be able to sense heat and thus to prey on warm-blooded mammals. So snakes and lizards are lepidosaurs, as is the tuatara. This is one group of diapsids which has survived until today. And future videos will then consider both the archosaurs, which include crocodiles, birds, and dinosaurs, but then also another group of diapsids which became adapted for marine life.